The gun hit the marble floor before anyone in the room understood what had happened. Marcus Hale, 12-year veteran of Hargrove Security, 6'3", 240 pounds of trained immovability, had his weapon drawn and aimed at the woman in the service entrance doorway. Then, she leaned forward. She said 4 words directly into his ear. And Marcus Hale's hands went slack. The gun fell, his face drained to the color of the limestone walls behind him. Around them, 40 guests at the most exclusive private fundraiser in Hargrove Tower's history stood in silk and tailored wool and watched the most composed security professional any of them had ever seen fold like paper. What none of them knew, what the man who'd ordered Marcus to remove her by any means necessary did not yet understand, was that the woman standing in that doorway owned something worth more than every account in the room. 5 years earlier, Nadia Osei arrived at Hargrove Tower through the service entrance for the first time, the way she always would, the way all contract cleaning staff did. The entrance was on the building's east side, a utilitarian door of gray steel that opened into a corridor of exposed concrete and overhead fluorescence. A world entirely separate from the 40-foot lobby with its imported travertine and the 2 Basquiat paintings that hung behind the reception desk like proof of something. Nadia had seen those paintings exactly once, on a day when a maintenance issue rerouted her through the main hall. She'd stopped for 6 seconds. Then, she'd moved on. She had floors to cover. She was 31 years old, the daughter of a Ghanaian economist who'd immigrated to the United States with his wife and 2 daughters when Nadia was 7. Her father had spent 15 years teaching macroeconomics at a state university and writing papers that were cited by people who would never invite him to their conferences. Her mother had run a small alteration shop out of their garage until her hands made it impossible. Nadia had gone to school on a merit scholarship, studied finance, graduated into the teeth of a recession, spent 2 years in a junior analyst role at a firm that laid off its entire junior class in a single Tuesday afternoon, and pivoted into contract work while she figured out what came next. Contract cleaning work paid immediately, required no lengthy hiring process, and, this mattered to her, left her evenings free for the things she'd been building quietly for 3 years. She was good at the work. Precise, fast, thorough in a way that made the supervisors notice and leave her alone, which was the specific combination she was after. She moved through the tower's upper floors like someone who understood that invisibility was sometimes its own form of power. The people whose offices she cleaned rarely looked at her directly. She'd long since stopped taking this personally. What they didn't see didn't concern them, and what they said within earshot of someone they decided wasn't worth watching, that concerned her very much. Hargrove Tower was the primary headquarters of Hargrove Capital Group, a private equity firm valued at somewhere north of $9 billion, run by a man named Elliot Hargrove, who had built his reputation over 3 decades on the specific genius of identifying undervalued assets and acquiring them before anyone else understood what they were worth. He was 62, silver-haired, the kind of man who moved through rooms as though the rooms had been arranged for his arrival. He was also, Nadia had come to understand over 18 months of cleaning his 34th floor conference room, the kind of man who spoke very freely around service staff. It started with the Thursday meetings. Every Thursday at 7:30 in the evening, after the building's regular staff had gone home, Elliot Hargrove held what his assistant referred to in scheduling as a strategy alignment. 6 people in the 34th floor conference room. The same 6, every week, sometimes with minor additions. Nadia's floor rotation put her on 34 on Thursday nights, beginning her shift at 7, moving through the executive wing offices before the conference room, which she'd clean after the meeting concluded. Standard procedure. Except that the meeting routinely ran long, and the conference room had a service corridor running along its eastern wall, accessible through an unmarked door that the building's architects had included for cable routing, and which, over the years, had become a storage space for backup AV equipment and spare chairs. Nadia used it for her supply cart on Thursday nights. The wall between the corridor and the conference room was not, it turned out, particularly well insulated. She heard them for the first time on a night when the ventilation system was running louder than usual, the kind of ambient noise that makes people forget to moderate their voices. She wasn't listening. She was restocking her cart, moving quietly, paying attention to her own work. Then she heard a number, a specific number. A number attached to a specific company name and a specific date. She stopped moving. She stood very still. She listened for 45 seconds. Then, she finished restocking her cart, wheeled it back to the elevator, and went home. That night, she opened the spreadsheet she'd been building for 2 years, the one with the data points she'd been quietly gathering. Publicly available information assembled with the patience of someone who understood that markets broadcast their intentions to anyone willing to compile the signals. She looked at the company name she'd heard in that conference room. She cross-referenced the date. She sat back in her chair and let what she was understanding settle into her. She was looking at insider trading. Not ambiguous, arguably interpretable, needs a lawyer to explain insider trading. She was looking at the thing itself, spoken plainly in a conference room by a man who had decided that the woman cleaning his building after hours was furniture. She did not panic. Panic was not a tool she'd ever found useful. She did 3 things. First, she wrote down precisely what she'd heard, in her own words, with the date and time, and saved it to an encrypted file she kept separate from everything else. Second, she called her cousin Jerome, who worked in the compliance division of a mid-sized brokerage and understood the regulatory architecture around securities violations in the specific, practical way that most people don't. Third, she went to sleep because she needed to think clearly, and thinking clearly required sleep. Over the following 8 weeks, she listened every Thursday, not crouched at the wall with a glass to her ear. She was never in the corridor for more than the time it took to manage her supplies. And she was careful about that. Careful in ways she'd thought through precisely. But the corridor was part of her routine. And what drifted through that wall, week after week, was a picture assembling itself with the specificity of a confession. She documented everything: dates, numbers, company names. The patterns in what she heard matched what she could trace in publicly available trading data, with a regularity that was not coincidence. Jerome, when she brought him what she had, carefully, hypothetically, as a question about how one might approach such a situation, told her that what she was describing, if documented the way she'd described, was exactly the kind of thing the sex whistleblower division existed to receive. She filed on a Monday morning, 9 weeks after the first Thursday she'd stopped moving in that service corridor. She filed through an attorney she'd researched, engaged, and paid out of the savings she'd accumulated across 3 years of contract work and one increasingly valuable side project. She filed with documentation, organized, dated, cross-referenced, and accompanied by a detailed explanation of how public trading data corroborated the specifics of what she'd heard. Then, she went back to work. She cleaned the 34th floor the following Thursday, as though nothing had changed. Because for her, at that moment, nothing had. The investigation was not fast. Federal investigations rarely are. For 4 months, nothing visible happened. Nadia continued her contract work, continued the project she'd been building, continued her Thursday nights on 34. She did not know when or whether anything would move. She knew only that she had put the truth in front of people whose job it was to act on it, and that she had done it with evidence rather than outrage, which was the only form of the truth that had ever protected anyone. What she did not know was that on the 34th floor, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but Elliot Hargrove was a man who had spent 30 years anticipating threats, and somewhere in the 4th month of the investigation, a thread came loose. A contact in a regulatory-adjacent office, someone who owed him information, mentioned that a filing had been made. The filing was confidential. The source was protected, but the description of the evidence, its specificity, the way it mapped to dates and locations, narrowed the origin in ways that a man like Hargrove knew how to interpret. He started reviewing the building's service records. He cross-referenced the floor rotation logs with the dates in the filing. He identified the cleaning staff assigned to 34 on Thursday evenings. There were 2 names. He investigated both. One was a man who'd worked for the contracting company for 11 years. The other was a woman named Nadia Osei, who had been on that assignment for 18 months, and whose background, when his security team dug into it, did not look like any cleaning contractor's background they had ever seen. Finance degree, analyst work history, and then the detail that made Hargrove's blood pressure spike in the quiet of his home office at midnight. A registered investment advisory filing, 18 months old, for a one-person firm called Osei Capital Research. He called Marcus Hale at 6 in the morning. The night of the fundraiser, Nadia was not supposed to be in the building. Her rotation had been quietly and deliberately modified 3 weeks prior, reassigned to different floors on a schedule that removed her from 34 entirely. She hadn't been told why. She'd noticed. Because she noticed everything, and she'd understood what it likely meant, and she'd made a decision. She had one remaining thing she needed. Not for the investigation. That file was submitted. That process was in motion. The sex timeline was their own. What she needed was for the record to be complete. There was a specific document she had seen on one specific Thursday, placed briefly on the conference room table before being collected and taken by Hargrove's general counsel. A document she'd glimpsed through the corridor door's gap as she retrieved a supply bin. She'd noted the title page. She'd noted enough to know what it was. She hadn't needed it then. She needed it now. She had her badge. Her access had not been fully revoked. An administrative gap she had identified and documented and did not intend to exploit beyond a single, specific, 20-minute window on a night when the building's security attention was concentrated on the fundraiser's main floor. She came through the service entrance at 9:17. She went up the service elevator. She had 11 minutes in the 34th floor records room before she heard the footsteps in the corridor outside. Marcus Hale filled the doorway the way trained security personnel do, fully, deliberately, leaving no ambiguity about what his presence meant. He had his weapon drawn. Behind him, 2 additional guards. In the atrium beyond the corridor, the fundraiser's murmur of crystal and wealth and self-congratulation continued undisturbed. He told her to put her hands where he could see them. She did. He told her she was trespassing. She said she understood. He told her she was going to come with him, and that it would be better for her if she didn't make this complicated. She looked at him for a moment. Then, she took one step forward. She said his full name first, Marcus James Hale, which was the detail that made him go still, because she'd said it the way people say names when they know more than the name. And then she leaned forward and said the 4 words she'd been holding since the moment she understood who else knew what she knew. His hands went slack. The gun fell. His face, in the fluorescent light of the service corridor of Hargrove Tower, lost every ounce of its trained composure, because the 4 words Nadia Ose whispered into Marcus Hale's ear were, "I have your name." Not a threat. A fact. His name, along with 3 others in Hargrove's security division, appeared in an email chain her attorney had obtained through discovery in a parallel civil proceeding. An email chain in which Elliot Hargrove's legal team had explicitly discussed using physical intimidation to identify and discourage the confidential filer. Marcus Hale had not sent any of those emails, but he had been copied on 2 of them, and he had not reported them, which, under the specific section of federal whistleblower protection law that Nadia's attorney had cited in her filing, made him a participant. He knew what that meant. She could see in his face that he knew exactly what that meant. She said it calmly, "I don't need anything from you. I need you to step aside." He stepped aside. The sex enforcement action against Elliot Hargrove and Hargrove Capital Group was made public 11 days later. The charges covered insider trading across 14 transactions over a 4-year period, totaling an estimated $340 million in illicitly gained advantage. The documentation cited as foundational to the investigation was described in the filing's public summary as having come from a confidential whistleblower whose observations were corroborated by an independent analysis of public market data. The kind of corroboration that made the evidence not just admissible, but overwhelming. Hargrove's attorneys entered their appearance the same morning. 3 board members of Hargrove Capital Group resigned by afternoon. By the following week, the firm's assets were under a preliminary freeze order while the full scope of the violations was assessed. Marcus Hale, in the end, cooperated. His cooperation came with conditions his attorney negotiated, and it came because the alternative, facing obstruction charges that would end a 12-year career and potentially result in criminal liability, was not a trade he was willing to make to protect a man who had put his name on an email without asking. He was suspended pending review. He was not, ultimately, charged. That outcome was not guaranteed, and he understood, in the months that followed, that it was the outcome it was, partly because the woman he'd drawn a weapon on had specified to her attorney that she was not interested in pursuing anyone whose cooperation served the larger case. That was the kind of precision with which Nadia Ose approached everything. Ose Capital Research launched publicly 8 months later. By that point, the sex whistleblower program had processed her award, a percentage of the financial penalties levied, consistent with the program's statutory formula, a number substantial enough to serve as the firm's entire first year of operating capital, with room remaining. She hired 2 analysts, both women, both recent graduates of programs that had not given them the opportunities they'd earned. She set up the office not in a tower, but in a converted row house on the east side of the city, the kind of building where the light came through old windows in the morning, and the floors had the particular warmth of wood that had been walked on for 100 years. She hung one thing on the wall of her office. Not a diploma, not a license, not a certificate. A printout of the public summary from the sex enforcement action. The paragraph that described the foundational evidence. The part about the confidential whistleblower, she'd read it many times, but she read it still. On mornings when the work was difficult, or the market was stubborn, or she needed to remember what it had cost to get here. The cleaning contract had ended the same week the investigation went public. She'd expected that. She'd also expected what came a few months later, a call from the contracting company's owner, a woman named Delphine, who had built her business over 22 years and who had, it turned out, her own complicated feelings about Hargrove Capital Group. Delphine wanted to refer a client, someone who'd heard through the specific grapevine of people who pay attention to regulatory enforcement actions, that Osei Capital Research had a particular gift for finding what was hidden in plain sight. Nadia took the call. She took the referral. She billed correctly and delivered more than she'd promised, which was the only business model she'd ever believed in. 5 years from the service entrance on the east side of Hargrove Tower to a firm that carried her name. 5 years of moving through spaces where no one thought to look at her carefully. 5 years of precision, patience, and the particular genius of understanding that invisibility, deployed correctly, was not a disadvantage. It was an asset. And Nadia Osei had always known how to value those.